Welcome back to another TapRooT podcast. This week I've got two special guests with me. I've got Emily and Barb.
Hey.
So this week we're going to be talking about the psychology behind decision making, and I'm just going to open it up to you guys. Why does decision making matter? What's the effect of decision making?
Barb, you want to take this?
Sure. Decision making matters because it helps us to understand why workers make mistakes. Sometimes we think it's because they're being complacent or they're just not paying attention or they just don't care. But it's really a lot more complex than that when you break decision making.
How can it be complex? They just have to follow the rules we gave them. They don't need to make decisions.
That's a kind of a common thing that I hear at all of our TapRooT courses when we're out teaching, especially during introductions when everyone's talking about problems that they have with their facility. But I think by the end of the course, they come to understand that human error is made for lots of different reasons.
So I think a common, maybe misconception, but maybe just things people think about. They think work is really prescriptive a lot of the time, that we just give them standard work or procedure and they're just going to follow it.
Right.
But oftentimes when people get into situations, maybe it didn't turn out to be the way the procedure said. Maybe there's something that was introduced, a problem. And when we see those, suddenly now people have to make decisions. Now, there's some different psychology behind decisions and some different ways that people make decisions. What are some of those things that affect people's decision? What's that decision-making process?
Yeah, I was thinking about this earlier today, and I think how workers perceive risk can influence their decisions. So a lot of times I hear when I'm reviewing investigations that people didn't think it was going to be a problem. It was only going to take a second.
The only going to take a second problem, yeah.
Just this once. And, perceiving the risk and identifying those hazards, I think, can be a real challenge. I mean, what do you think about that? How can we make that better? How can we? So
you've got something where you're saying people don't necessarily recognize risk.
Yeah.
What is leading them to not see things? I mean, the risk is obvious, right? What kind of things lead people to not recognize risk?
Sometimes it's pressure. If there's a pressure or demand on something, we're trying to meet a deadline. When you get that tunnel vision, you might not realize that things are going on around you. You're skipping steps, and in that hastiness, just forgetting the risks that are involved, and not making a decision, not following a decision that you already know you're supposed to do is still a decision. We just don't realize that we're making decisions by not doing what we're supposed to be doing.
So, I always hear the operator's in a hurry. People say, the operator's in a hurry.
Right.
Why is being in a hurry something that's causing a problem with decisions?
Pressure. Time pressure.
People take shortcuts.
Yeah.
So it's forcing them to take shortcuts, but from a cognitive standpoint, right? Mm-hmm. How much time does it take to make a decision? I mean, I make decisions really quickly. I'm not going to fret over it. I just pick the thing and go, right?
I think our cognitive biases are getting in there, right? The confirmation bias, overconfidence bias.
And the brain takes shortcuts. And so if our brain's taking shortcuts and we're taking literal shortcuts, it's a recipe for disaster.
I think often when I think about speed in decision making, there's a couple different things that I've seen people look at. They've looked at things like pilot decision making. A lot of times, think of jet pilots, fighter pilots. They're having to make very fast decisions in very chaotic situations. Mm-hmm. And I'm often taken back to the Chuck Yeager and breaking the sound barrier. And Mark and I use this to kind of talk about knowledge-based decision-making. And that was always a funny story for Chuck Yeager. For those who don't know Chuck Yeager, he's the first person to survive breaking the sound barrier in a jet. He wasn't the first person to break the sound barrier. That guy died. And it crashed right before him. And so they had a choice. Chuck Yeager volunteered. I think there was a Boeing pilot or something like that was wanting to be paid a lot of money to do this since the previous guy died. But, Air Force pilot said, I'm going to do it. He'd rather just do it for the fun of it. So Chuck Yeager goes to, get in the plane, takes off. He actually does it with a broken arm. Full story somewhere else. I'm sure we've told it before. But he goes to take off. And when he breaks the sound barrier, something changes in basically the flow of the air. The fluid flow of the air changes from laminar to turbulent flow, which changes the physics of the aircraft. And suddenly Chuck starts spinning because he's got a rocket on the back, and he just starts flipping, and he blacks out. Now, I don't know about you, but there's a moment of confusion and panic and decisions that have to be made when you wake up from blacking out after breaking the sound barrier, and you have to figure out where you are. You have to look at what are your readings, what's happening, I'm flipping like this with a rocket. How do I make decisions to get out of that? And I think in those cases, this is where, they say, well, you just try something, right? Trial and error. But I don't know that people necessarily are being logical about it. Because I don't think it's like Chuck's, spinning, okay, these are the 5 things I have control over. Let me make a list of them and make the best decision. They're not doing a pros and cons. He's going, okay, I'm doing this. I need to try something and see if I can change my situation. So I think a lot of times when you're in those kind of panic situations, people's decisions and actions are a little bit of a coin flip.
I think it depends on the person, the training, the background. Every situation, every scenario is going to be different, but if you don't train for the unexpected, then you don't have anything to pull from. So I don't know, maybe he had some simulations that he went through before. Maybe he thrives under chaos. But he
was a very experienced pilot in that situation, and so he was able to get control and move from this type of spinning, which is uncommon, to something that was easier for him to regain control with, and he was able to land successfully. And congrats, you survived, and your go down in history for the first person to break the sound barrier. So those are kind of, I think, an interesting, there's a pressure that can be put on somebody for making decisions based on speed. What other kind of pressures can cause problems in decision making?
I think groupthink. If you're working with a team, I've seen several people talk about this, that the crew knew what was supposed to be done, but one person was taking charge, and then other people on the team started to doubt themselves.
So what's groupthink for the group, for the people watching?
Yeah, for groupthink is when everybody comes to the same opinion, everybody comes to the same thinking, and usually there's 1 or 2 people driving that thinking, and everybody just kind of jumps on board.
Like the bandwagon effect.
Yeah,
bandwagon,
effect.
yeah. So we're jumping onto something, and does this lead to people not questioning decisions? Or is this something more I'll just trust that they've got the right answer? What's kind of the problems with groupthink?
I think it's both. I think sometimes it's just a matter of people trusting other people, just believing they have the answers, or being unsure in their own knowledge. I think when you're talking before about knowledge-based decisions, just to explain to everybody out there, that's just a different level of knowledge. That's when you don't have an innate skill. It's not intuitive. You don't have a procedure telling you what the rules is. Of course, that pilot's not going to be able to grab, okay, what's the procedure for this? He's just going to have that level of knowledge that he knows what comes next. So it is a lot to think about, and we do have to think about, what is the skill level? Is this something that anyone should know how to do just intuitively? Is it something that someone should be having a procedure to follow to know what to do correctly? Or is it something that, as Emily talked about, someone has been trained and they're just experienced and they know what the answer is? Another
part of that with the groupthink as well, when you take it into the investigation level, that's why it's one-on-one for the interview, kind of expanding on that groupthink. If we were all in the same room talking about what happened, if my memory, my recollection's not as sharp, and you say something and I trust you, then I'm going to go, maybe I had it wrong, and I might agree or change mentally before I talk what happened on my point and just go along with what you said because I value what you think, and maybe question my own interpretation of that event. So gotta be careful with groups, and especially groupthink, and the driver behind that.
You see the story start developing, and people will tack on and latch hold of the story, and they'll start echoing the same points to each other. You definitely see that a lot when it comes to asking people while you're building out and understanding what happened in incident investigation. I think this is true as well when you think of like large meetings. I've never been accused of this, but I am a driver personality, and I think there are definitely personalities that are more akin to, well, I'm going to share my opinion, and there are other personalities that are less willing to, speak up in front of a group, and so they'll just follow with the loud person. Sometimes loudest wins in these situations, and they'll, instead of speaking up, they're going to just go with what that person, because they'd rather not argue. They'd rather not, share their expression. So I think, groupthink can definitely inhibit decisions. What other types of pressures or problems inhibit people's ability to make, we won't say good decisions, but make decisions?
Sometimes it's just the familiarity of something where you undervalue the risk. You've done it so many times, and you think, it's safe because I've done it so long and I haven't had an accident. That's where the corners are getting cut, those pressures are on, thinking, oh, well, that's not going to happen to me.
It won't happen to me. It's never happened to me in the past, therefore it'll never happen to me in the future, right? There's a fallacy in there somewhere. So we might find ourselves believing that just because we did it, we were successful the last time we broke this rule, we should be successful this time. That can lead us to underestimating risk, which I think you mentioned before, underestimating the risk of these decisions. Now, what is kind of the decision-making process that people go through? Is there any steps that people go through when making decisions? What does that look like from a mental standpoint?
It's probably cognitively pretty quick. We don't realize all the steps that we're going through. I mean, the first thing is you've got to identify what that decision is. And it's not always as simple as a yes or no. I mean, even not doing anything is a decision. So after you identify the decision, you've got to, evaluate, look at those alternatives and decide on what's the mode of action. So there's probably a process over a couple of seconds of weighing the pros and cons, pulling from your memory banks of, well, has this ever happened before? What would happen if I do it this way? Are there risks involved? Some people, like I said, are going to think differently, like your Chuck Yeager analogy. He's probably going through a Rolodex of, well, if I do this, it's going to, I don't know, airline terms or flight terms, but he probably is able to quickly pull while in chaos, assess calmly some of those memory reserves in aid to that decision process.
Yeah, I think a lot of when you're pulling from experience, and maybe Chuck's saying, he goes, well, this is how I would recover from this type of position. So if I do something similar, let me see if it does a similar type of recovery for this. So, that kind of thinking can get you into, well, I have this idea of how to handle a certain situation. Now, an interesting thing I read about recently was a term, it was called pattern matching. Have you ever heard about pattern matching?
I don't think so.
So for us and what we think of chunking. So when we think of memory and how memory works, you kind of can chunk information. Pattern matching is kind of a different term of the same effect. There was a study done in the 1940s with chess grandmasters. So we think of, it was a guy named, and I'll get his name here, Adrian de Groot. I was thinking de Groot, right? So he was an amateur chess player. He was not professional. He was part of chess clubs, and he kept getting beat by all these grandmasters. And, he's like, they're smarter. They're just smarter. They've got to have like a photographic memory or something. These guys have just got to be geniuses. That's why they're so good at this. So he went to test it, and what he would do is he would set up a chessboard with 20 pieces, and he would put them in different configurations, and pretty typical, kind of like a game configuration. And he would have amateurs, intermediate players, and grandmasters come up and take a quick glance at the board. And their goal was to memorize the board. And what he found was that grandmasters were really good at this. That they could just look at the board, peek it, and find basically all the pieces. And in looking at this, he said, well, they had all this pattern matching because they could recognize, oh, this is the Queen's Indian, or, oh, this is this French opening, so I could roughly tell where the pieces are. And at first he's like, oh man, they just memorized all this stuff, and that's how they figured it out. But what happened is he went back and said, okay, let's put them in a random configuration, something that would never happen, in a configuration that would never happen naturally in chess. And suddenly the Grandmaster's ability to memorize all these pieces fell back to basically normal level for everyone else. Because what they had really done is they had all these patterns that they were used to, and so when they could take a glance, they could see roughly where things were at, and they knew that configuration. So it wasn't that they were really good at just memorizing the board. They were really specific in their memory. So I think a lot when you look at like decisions and what makes the difference between a grandmaster and a different, different levels in chess is their ability to recognize patterns and make decisions based on that.
Yeah,
so
that's more analytical thinking, I think, and what gets us away from that are our biases and intuition. So, and everybody gives bias a bad name, but we have biases for a reason, and that is because if we had to think through everything step by step, everything we do all day, our brains would just explode. It'd just be too much information. So we develop these biases for healthy reasons, but they're really hard to break sometimes. And a lot of times workers will make decisions based on these biases or heuristics and intuition and not look at it analytically like you just were describing. So that's one way to kind of break out of that, is to be more analytical and view things in that. But one thing I'm curious, Alex, to hear your opinion on is normalization of deviance, because I've seen you talk about it, I've seen you write about it. How do you think that plays into decision making?
So, there's a lot of, when we look at Rickover and kind of his philosophy behind decisions, he had several principles that helped guide the decision making of his group, and it kind of became a staple in the Navy, and we think some of those decisions are important. So one of those ideas for is called conservative decision making, and so the idea behind it is you need to make decisions with experts where you're keeping, and I always call it the ultimate goal in mind. So your ultimate goal for Rickover was nuclear safety. Make decisions for nuclear with the nuclear safety as your highest priority. We're not going to go critical. We're not going to have a meltdown or put reactor at risk. We make decisions that don't put the reactor at risk. So you make conservative decisions from that standpoint. So first, as a company, you'd have to establish what is your ultimate goal. It might be doing things safely. It might be operations. It might be profit. Whatever it is, that's your ultimate goal. Well, your leadership is going to be making decisions conservatively to match that ultimate goal. So one example that we kind of use for this is the Nautilus. So for those who don't know, in the nuclear Navy, submarines were not originally nuclear powered. So when you had basically gas-powered submarines, you had to come up for air, you had to do venting, you had to get refueling. There's lots of things that had to happen. So if you could have a nuclear-powered submarine, you could stay under longer. You didn't have to go back to port as much. There's a lot of advantages. So Rickover led the program to build the first nuclear submarine, the Nautilus. Well, while they were building this, they had a problem of basically some percentage of the pipes that they installed for steam pipes had a defect in the chemistry. Now, the question is, what was the risk with this? So Rickover asked his experts, and they said, well, eventually these pipes could fail, and they'll fail probably faster than what we want them to. However, we can run these and do our initial sub-tests, then pull it back. We'll have beaten the Soviets. This was during, kind of that space race era. So we could beat the Soviets to the first nuclear power submarine, and we'll be good. So the advisors were saying, Rickover, you can run this risk and you'll be fine. But Rickover believed that setting this precedent of we'll run at risk would set the precedent of we always take risks in the Navy. And so he realized his decision had an effect on how other people would make decisions in the future.
So they went ahead and replaced it, right?
They replaced all the pipes. It took, I don't remember how much extra time it took, but it was considerable. They had to pull out, because you couldn't do non-destructive testing to find out the difference. You had to basically cut it open and look at the chemistry. So they basically had to remove all the pipes and reinstall. Luckily, they had found this first on the test. So the way they built this, they actually were building the prototype while building the submarine. It was like we started this 3 months before this kind of thing. So like they were a little bit ahead with the test that they were building in Idaho. And so they discovered it early enough that they were able to fix enough of the problems. And we still won the race and had the first nuclear-powered submarine.
Hearing you tell that makes me think of Maypops. Tires that you don't know. At any moment, it could happen, but you don't know when. And so the best thing to do, instead of take that risk, is just to go ahead and get new tires. So they went ahead and replaced all the pipes. And, we even have, thinking about tires, back to that analogy, there's, life tire, how many miles of a warranty or how long this can last. And it varies from tire to tire, from manufacturer and all that. But there's no true level, of how with wear and tear, that number can easily change. So
all I know is anytime I pull into a tire place, they want me to replace them. That's all I know. It doesn't matter.
I look at some other things.
I could have bought it last week, and they're gonna say I need new tires.
But kind of dipping into the maintenance side of things, we have to have something, a baseline to work with, and with decision making. That all ties back into all that again, is that we have some kind of baseline to know, at least I'm not going to do that. And so going into the conservative side of decision making, I think a lot of times people may have external influences to those decisions to say, okay, I know I'm about to deviate, but what's that risk? What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen, when we're looking at safety, when we're looking at all these other aspects, and the quickness of that decision, it's still involving the what ifs to a level that somebody's got to make a quick choice, but they're still weighing those pros and cons.
So Rickover's approach to this was, one, get the experts in the room. Two, it's to make decisions based on, is this increasing? And his part was, is this in line with our beliefs of nuclear safety, of are we making a decision that's putting things at risk, or are we making a decision that's putting things under control? And so his was always trying to keep it in control with us and making those decisions. So he would rather shut down something and do it safe than run at risk just for a performance metric. Some way else to think about this, a lot of nuclear industry ones, they kind of use a term called STAR. So for decision making, they say you want to stop, think, act, and then review. And so the idea is that you stop when you recognize you're in a decision state, think about it, make a plan of action, and then after you've taken that action, review the effect of it. And we do these little mini stars as we make actions. Now, the criteria for when to do that is not always clear in industry. Some people say you do it when you're doing abnormal work. Some people say you do it when you're doing routine work. Some people say you do it during both, which to me just sounds like always. If I'm doing it during routine and I'm doing it during irregular work, that's always. So the guidance on it's a little not clear. And the biggest problem is you have to recognize you're in a error-likely situation. We kind of mentioned a couple of those, being in a hurry, groupthink, stuff like that.
Company culture has a lot to do with it too.
It does.
That drives what the decision making looks like. The opposite of a groupthink, the bandwagon effect. But when you have Rickover setting a precedent of this is the expectation. If we cut corners here, it's going to let everybody else think we can cut corners everywhere else. That can also be a driver for making the right decisions.
And a lot of this is very much cultural in there, that you have to set the expectation. And I want to be clear to those watching that setting the expectation is not done at the operator level, it's done at the leadership level. Leadership is the one that controls those expectations. And it has to go down from top to middle to bottom to the operator level. You can't insert it at the bottom and say, well, I'm just going to tell them to exercise their stop work authority. You have to have leadership that's driving that stop work authority to say, hey, we don't take these kinds of risks.
But communication can't just be from top down. Boots have to report back up so that where those hiccups are, that it's being fully communicated and can be adjusted and any kind of changes that need to be made. So we need communication reciprocal.
Yeah, the two-way street. I've always, I don't know about always, but I currently describe the two-way street as leadership communicates our values down. Operators communicate when reality doesn't match those values.
That's good. Yeah.
And I think that's the two-way street because, we need operators to tell us, hey, this is not our values, we need to stop. That's what stop work really is operators saying, hey, our value is we don't put ourselves at risk. Our value is that we don't take shortcuts with this. I have to take a shortcut and put myself at risk if I continue the work. So I'm going to stop and get support, get your manager, get your engineering, get whoever, get the technical expertise in here so that we can make an appropriate risk decision in there. So I definitely think having a moment to pause in there. But when we think about decision making, you can't always have those stops. So what are some things you guys can think of that kind of fit in here? If I'm having to make quick decisions, what are things that help people make quick decisions?
I think training, one, if you train people and have a good training program, that helps them to know what the next step is. Another thing is habit formation. So one of the best books I've ever read is Atomic Habits by James Clear. Big fan of his, read his book about 3 times. And it's not just at the point of decision that it's important to have those habits, but it just frees your mental space. If you've got good habits for your day, that gives you that much more mental space to make better decisions. So, training and just promoting good habits.
That sounds like there's a guy, he wears the same colored shirt, not the same shirt, but he just bought 20 of the same shirt, 20 of the same pants. I don't have to make a decision. I just grab the same shirt every day. Yeah. And oh man, all that time he's freed up for decision making.
Wasn't that like Zuckerberg or something?
It was somebody, I can't remember.
But it does, in the repetition of the day, without having to what am I going to wear? It's like you grab and go.
I'm kind of like that too. When I go teach a course, I have my TapRooT shirts.
I got all my TapRooT shirts.
I don't need to be thinking about what I'm going to wear. I need to be thinking about getting ready for my day. So I those little things really do help.
But that's where it can also be a problem, because have you ever left the house and you go, oh, did I lock the door? Because you get into that repetition so much that you can do things and not even remember or realize, did I do it or did I not?
So I think that's a good point to kind of tie in with this from a decision-making standpoint, because I think, when something becomes so routine, there also becomes elements of surprise. And when you're hit by something unexpected, it'll when you're driving's another good example. I'm on the same route. I drive every day into work.
And it's the weekend. You're like...
And I just made a turn onto the road that I go, Georgia, I'm heading right in. Autopilot gets you there. And so there is time you have to have things that break you out of autopilot. Now, when we think of work, that's where we rotate people. That's where you try to rotate tasks so that you can break out of that autopilot. Because if you're doing something really, really routine for too long, your ability to detect problems drops dramatically. And so that's the point where, oh no, I've missed this because I went into autopilot mode. So definitely rotating people helps with these kind of things.
Sure.
What other techniques kind of help people with decisions and dealing with some of these cognitive problems and cognitive load problems?
I think one of the best ways is to first start fresh. when we're starting our day, making sure that we're taking care of ourselves, getting adequate sleep, eating, knowing what our circadian rhythm looks like. I know where my downslope is, where I'm cognitively not as awake, not as prepared. So typically, if I can avoid it, that 2 p.m. crash is not a good time for me to be in some deep work, because otherwise I'm going through the motions. I've already had lunch, I'm tired, it's getting towards the end of the day. The uptick is in towards 6 o'clock, everybody's home making dinner, so that's a great time for me to do catch up on emails. Yeah. So kind of noticing where those deficits are in your day and what helps you function and just be optimal, I think helps fuel proper decision making, because if we're hungry, if we're tired, there's all these other things that can get in the way and affect proper decision making.
Now that's counterintuitive, because there's no operator that would ever worry about that. That's another Bang energy can. You just chug another Red Bull, chug another energy drink. I don't get tired. I just get more energy drinks. That's the mindset, right? That's very much operative mindset. Is we're just everybody's coming in tired to work. We're just going to drink our coffee, right? We got to get our way through the day, which I guess caffeinating and that does help for staying awake. I think if we want to get optimum, definitely having sleep is going to help us make better decisions. And I think us and every doctor out there would agree getting enough sleep will help us. We all know that we make worse decisions when we're fatigued. Mm-hmm. I like what you said about thinking about what times of days you're doing work. Now, you don't always have control in that. Right? We've got to be on the whole time we're teaching, right? We've got to be, have that personality, even if it's after lunch. Though I avoid, at our courses, we always have a dessert at lunch. I always avoid it because I'm going to eat sugar and crash, and I can't do that. So you got to be mindful of those kind of decisions as well. Yeah. I think something else to think about from a decision-making standpoint is getting information to people. So people make decisions with the information they have. And oftentimes, we talked about situational awareness, that we had a podcast on that one. That perception of information, that perception comes in, and how I get information, if I don't receive it, I can't process it and understand it and recognize error. So we have to make sure that information is easy to perceive, easy to understand, because there's that cognitive load of having to process it and recognize the significance of it. Mm-hmm. So alarms, displays, controls, all those things that help us receive information, I think, are a big part in decision making, is getting that information to people so they can make an appropriate decision.
And part of that reminds me of communication, like shift turnover, giving those instructions, long messages, being careful not to give employees too much information at one time. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That goes back into crisis communication as well. So people will believe the first thing they hear. They kind of hang on to that. It's proven through science. So if there's something that's happening and you want to communicate to your people, you can tell them, we're aware there's a situation, we're working on it, and we will give you an update once we have, more details. So that way they don't have fear of what's going on. They know you're handling it. And then once you have all that information, then you can give that one message that explains what the protocol is, what the next steps are.
Yep.
And then, that kind of leads into psychological safety. Do the workers feel comfortable if they're about to make a decision that their gut is telling them not to do? Do they feel comfortable reporting that or saying something about it? Mm-hmm. That's something to think about too for decision making.
Yeah.
Yep. So we definitely I think we've covered a lot of different topics in here, from looking at how people make decisions, chess grandmasters, breaking the sound barrier. We've got a lot of different things for making decisions. If I wanted to learn more about the psychology behind decision making, if I wanted to learn more about how to improve this decision making process, what are some opportunities coming up that people can use?
Well, we have a great opportunity coming up. Emily and I are working on the psychology improvement track at the upcoming summit, so we're real excited about that.
Yeah, you guys are the track leaders for that.
There's 9 different sessions that are related to psychology in various capacities. And we also have an e-learning platform. It's self-guided, where you can learn about body language, investigative interviewing techniques, emotional intelligence, all things to help you improve. And they are backed by psychology and proven science techniques, not just random ideas. So it's very, very interesting, and we're excited about it.
So they can come enjoy great talks from you guys and others about psychology at the Global TapRooT Summit, or they can look at this Learning Teams platform. They can find both of those links down below at our website. We want to thank you guys for taking time to watch the video with us, and thank you too for sharing great information with everybody. If you want to share interesting things about decisions you've had to make, put them down in the comments. What are some times you've had to make those snap decisions or difficult decisions? Put them down in the comments. We'd love to hear from you guys. Also, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell if you want more great podcast episodes, and we will see you guys in the next TapRooT Podcast episode.
All right.